Class, thank you so much for joining me today. So in today's lecture, we're going to be thinking through how what we're going to call non-wage amenities are chosen in competitive labor market equilibria. And what I mean by non-wage amenities is essentially everything about the quality of a job you have, right? Things that you like or dislike about your job that aren't money going into your pocket, right? So we'll think about anything from the quality of healthcare, health insurance provided by your employer, the safety equipment used, right, if you're in a manufacturing facility or something similar, the number of breaks that you get and the flexibility you have in terms of when you take breaks, right, amount of vacation time you get, whether your chair is comfortable, whether your office is well decorated, all of these various characteristics that determine how much somebody likes their job that don't have to do with the number written on their paycheck. Now, the reason that this is important is because while we've talked about jobs so far purely in terms of wages, right, in terms of selling leisure time in order to receive income, in reality, these other aspects of jobs are incredibly important, right? I mean, most people who are employed full-time spend maybe not a majority of their waking hours, but the largest chunk of their waking hours at work as they do anywhere else. And so the quality of your life at work has a lot to do with your quality of life overall. And therefore, it's very important for us to understand why some jobs provide people with higher quality of life than others, right? More enjoyable experiences on the job than others. It's also going to be really important to think about non-wage amenities and how they're determined for a wide variety of important policy questions. If we care about something like the gender wage gap, for example, there's a great deal of research suggesting that occupations that have more flexibility in working hours, both fewer requirements to work very long hours, but also more ability to choose which hours you work, tend to have smaller gender wage gaps because women continue to have more out-of-work responsibilities on average than men, right? So understanding why some jobs offer more flexible hours and why others don't is really important if we want to understand the gender wage gap. If we want to understand workplace safety, right, we want to think about the right way or the right situations in which the government ought to regulate safe working conditions. Understanding how markets determine how safe workplaces are going to be is really important, right? And likewise, if you're thinking about yourself as someone who might run a business someday or manage employees someday, this is going to be a useful framework to think through questions about when is it going to be profitable or in your business interest to provide workers with higher quality of life at work, right? When you want to pay for the nice holiday or provide more flexible working hours or any of these sorts of things. Okay, wonderful. So this is essentially what we're going to be doing today. So I'm going to start out with probably the simplest way to think about this question, which is to think about how we expect wages to differ between different types of work that are more or less pleasant, right? And particularly for occupations where workers can freely choose to shift from one occupation to the other. So to think through this, let's imagine that once you return to campus, you can get two kinds of campus jobs, right? One opportunity, one possibility, you can work at the Green Bean. And the Green Bean's really nice, right? Because, you can get some free or discounted coffee. I'm not totally sure how it works. You see your friends coming in, the music's pretty good, right? So let's imagine, we're going to have labor, we're going to have the wage of the Green Bean, some supply of labor like this, some demand for labor like that, and an equilibrium. We're going to forget about the fact that the college sets wage rates here, right? Pretend that we're in a competitive market. Let's say that the competitive equilibrium wage of the Green Bean was $15 an hour. Okay, so that's option one. Option two is that you can work for me as a grader, right? The only problem is, what am I doing here? Only problem is that if you work for me as a grader, you have to come to my office and sit in my office. That wouldn't be so bad, except I have just an uncontrollable flatulence problem, so it's pretty unpleasant work, right? There's a lot of disadvantages to working for me as a grader. So let's think about what would happen if we started out with exactly the same wage of $15 an hour, if you work at the Green Bean, where you get free coffee and cool music and friends, or if you work for me as a grader and you have to deal with, the odor of my office. Well, one thing you might expect, right? One thing I would expect is that if the two jobs offer exactly the same wage, most people, let's say all people, would prefer to work for $15 an hour at the green bean than to work for $15 an hour as a grader for me, right? So as a consequence, our labor supply at the green bean is going to shift out, right? Some people are going to say, why am I here if I could be there? Right? And likewise, for exactly the same reason, labor supply for me is going to shift in. Right? What's this going to do? It's going to lower wages at the green bean. It's going to increase wages working for me. Right? Because when wages are equal, no one's going to want to work for me. Everyone's going to want to work at the green bean. Eventually, as people leave my employ and move over to the green bean's employ, we're eventually going to have a wage gap that becomes large enough, right, to convince people that now they're indifferent between the two jobs, right? So if people were generally willing to give up $2 an hour to not have to deal with my office, right, we would expect this wage gap to expand up until it was $2 an hour, right? In other words, at this point, if it's now $16 an hour working for me and $14 an hour at the green bean, now the marginal worker is going to say, you know what? I'd love to work, I like mine. I also like the job at the green bean better. At this point, I'm indifferent between these two jobs, right? And once workers are indifferent between these two jobs, in other words, the total value of compensation for me or at the green bean is equal, people are going to stop shifting out of grading for me and towards working at the green bean. This make sense? Right, so what we're saying is that we've got two different types of jobs. Workers are free to choose which of these jobs to work in. The difference in pay between the two jobs is going to reflect the value workers place on the amenities of one job relative to the other, right? So if all workers agree that it's worth giving up $2 an hour to work at the green bean rather than to work for me, then the wage difference between the jobs in equilibrium is going to be $2 an hour. This makes sense? And if the workers didn't agree, the wage difference would essentially represent the difference in the value the marginal worker would place on one job relative to the other, right? In other words, maybe there's some people with no sense of smell who would be willing to work for me for an extra $1 an hour, other people who would only be willing to work for $5 an hour. But if at a wage difference of $2 an hour, we've got supply equal to demand, that's going to be the wage difference that holds, right? And the person who's just on the edge between these two jobs values the green bean's amenities at $2 an hour. Wonderful. Now, this is an old idea. This actually goes back all the way to Adam Smith, who basically said the whole of the advantages and disadvantages of different employment of labor and stock must in the same neighborhood be either perfectly equal or continually trending towards equality. If in the same neighborhood there was any employment either evidently more or less advantageous than the rest, so many people would crowd into it in one case and so many people would desert it in the other case that its advantages would soon return to the level of other employments. This would at least be the case in a society where things were left to follow their rational course, where there was perfect liberty, and where every man was perfectly free to choose what occupation he thought proper, and to change it as often as he thought proper. Right? In other words, if we allow wages to be set by the market, and wage differences and if workers are able to freely move from one to the other, then wage differences are going to reflect the differences in amenity values of the occupations, so that working at the green bean is just as good as working for me. Right? If instead we say all jobs have to pay $15 an hour, then we're going to have a surplus of labor in the green bean and a shortage of labor for me, and the green bean job is going to be objectively better. Cool. Right, so compensating wage differentials means jobs with better amenities pay more, worse amenities pay less, so that jobs who hire the same type of workers are equally valuable. Okay, so let's use this concept a little bit before we move on to fancier, more graphical things. So based on this, let's say that I told you that on average, the earnings of physicians in the United States, right, doctors, is about $200,000 a year. And the average wage of farm workers is about $15,000 a year. Is this going to imply that being a farm worker is much more pleasant or has much better amenities than being a doctor? No, right? I mean, that's a little bit silly. The reason this isn't going to imply this is because farm workers aren't able to freely shift over to working as doctors, right? In order to become a doctor, you have to have years and years of medical school, years and years of residency. You have to have good enough, MCAT scores to get into med school in the first place. And so this is not a situation where workers can freely choose one job or the other so that we expect market forces to equilibrate total compensation. Right, doctors earn more not because being a doctor is less pleasant, but because being a doctor is exclusive, right? It's hard to be a doctor, and people who work as farm workers, for the most part, aren't able to work as doctors. Cool. Okay. Another example. Back in the 1960s and 1970s, we had asbestos used in a wide variety of industrial applications. But it's a very, very common insulation material. Construction workers worked with asbestos all the time. Now, in the 1970s, we learned that exposure to asbestos greatly increases someone's likelihood of contracting mesothelioma, which is a type of lung cancer, and having a premature death. Right, but prior to the 1970s, no one had any idea that there were dangers associated with working with asbestos. So, should we expect that jobs that use asbestos pay more in, let's say, 1950? Right, when this was a very common construction material, I shouldn't say should here, I should say would. Right, would you get a compensating differential in 1950 because of the fact that by working in an asbestos mine or a construction site that used asbestos, you were exposing yourself to a risk of early and horrible death? No, right? Why not? Because nobody realized, right? Nobody knew that asbestos was exposing them to these dangers. And even after many of the companies making asbestos knew, the workers themselves did not know. Right, so we should only expect compensating wage differentials to arise when workers are aware of the amenity values of different types of jobs and take those amenity values into account when they decide which types of jobs to work in. Okay, wonderful.